We'll just wait a second for all the witnesses to be ready.
The proceeding is currently...
Thank you very much. Well, we go back into public session now, and my name's Nicholas True. I'm chairman of the committee. We won't introduce ourselves because our names are there. As you know, the session is open to the public. It's going out live on the parliamentary website and will stay there. There will be a verbatim report which you will be permitted to see and correct for the purposes of clarification or accuracy. Welcome to you all, and welcome back, Sir John. We've had seen you before, but we're very welcome to come back to public session. So if you could, for the record, introduce yourselves, then we'll go straight into the question. Yes.
I'm John Hills. I'm Richard Titmus, Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics.
I'm Warwick Lightfoot. I'm the Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange.
I'm Caris Roberts, and I'm a Senior Economist at IPPR.
Hi, Rory Meakin, Research Fellow at the TaxPayers Alliance.
Thank you very much. The remit, obviously, of the committee is to look at issues of intergenerational fairness or otherwise. We're very well aware of there are many intra-generational issues, but for the purpose of this inquiry, we're focusing on the broader intergenerational issues. And in this session, obviously, we're looking at taxation and benefit in particular. And so perhaps if I could ask a citing question from the chair, which would be, do you think that the balance of tax and benefits as is fair between generations? And if not, which generations have been unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged? Who would like to come in? Yes, we'll start with John.
I think the short answer to that is no. I think you need to distinguish between generations in the sense of when we were born and generations in terms of our ages at any one time. There is maybe a little bit of an inevitability that some of us born in the years immediately after the Second World War, a large generation, have done rather well out of the system in terms of the balance between taxes and services and benefits we have received and expect to receive, because we've been able to share the working age tax burden amongst a large number of us. And we've been looking forward to systems that have been offering us, for instance, pensions from an age which did not previously move very fast. Although I know that's a very sore subject for women born in the same year as me, 1954. But just as a generality, that slow adjustment has lent, and other things connected with it, has meant a benefit to people born in 1945 to 1960. But looking more immediately at ages, it seems to me that we've developed a system where taxation is unduly concentrated on the working age generation and is rather light by comparison on the wealthier part of the younger retired or over pension age generation, in particular in the tax treatment of assets and income from assets. And that connects to some of your other interests in terms of the structure of the national insurance system.
Okay. Anybody else?
I actually don't share John's view, actually. I think that it's a very big mistake to myopically try and actually pitch one cohort, one generation against another. Modern economies and advanced economies have been very good in the last 70 or 80 years in developing effective welfare states that, when you get the balance of it right, actually helps your market economy to work better than it otherwise would do. And I'm sure that John and I both agree on that. And you effectively try and actually share risks that households on their own can't manage, private credit markets can't really manage, and private insurance can't really manage. You have to decide where you're going to intervene, what you're going to spend. And then you've got to decide how you're going to raise the revenue to do it. And you want to raise that revenue in a manner that does least distortion and involves least deadweight costs to your performance of your economy in the long term. And you need to actually probably have an eye to those with the broadest back making the biggest effective contribution where they can do so, but not carrying that so far that you begin to actually crowd out your economic base so that you compound growth in GDP and your economy at a slower rate than you otherwise would do. So although it feels quite nice right now we make the decisions, in 15 or 20 years' time you will actually be attempting to tax a rather smaller economic base. And I think we've done quite well at substantially modifying market incomes, helping people who are in difficulty, and actually helping to support people when they are older, and doing quite well extracting large sums of money at the very high end of the earnings distribution without undermining the capacity to actually expand and compound your economy. And I think one has got to be very careful before one thinks that you can get large amounts of revenue out of capital and property, because there's not an alignment between income and the capital valuation that is reported. Economists have had enormous difficulty with capital. One of the biggest controversies in the 1950s and 1960s was the capital controversy. I don't think it was ever quite sorted out. And it's flows of income, flows of expenditure that you're able to tax, and a capital valuation at any one time, in my view, will not be a reliable source of recurrent revenue to finance the complex spending programmes and welfare state that we have. So I think we've got the broad framework reasonably right. What we have done in the last 40 years is to give much greater emphasis on helping working-age families in difficulty. And some of you, forgive me for saying so, but certainly the chairman, and I can look around other friends around the room who will appreciate what I'm about to say now. If you think of the agenda that was developed by the late Sir Maurice Finer in helping families in difficulty, particularly lone parent families, and the agenda that you were involved in when FIS was turned into family credit, and then later on in the 1990s the tax credit system was developed to help working age families with children. I think we've done quite a good job at redressing the balance and at the same time reining in the transfer payments made to retired incomes. You think of the restrictions on the pension between 1981 and 2010, the reduction in the SERPs that took place, the substantial changes to tax payments made into pension funds in 1993 by Norman Lamont and later by Gordon Brown in 1997, and of course some of the benefits in kind in social services. Those of you who've been involved in local government and the voluntary organisations that support local government will know the eligibility criteria in terms of long-term care. So I think in terms of actually striking that balance, we've done quite a lot. And of course I haven't mentioned raising the pension age or what was done in terms of gender neutrality in terms of older women.
Okay. Well, we've got 4 witnesses, so we'll have to keep the pace up a bit. Would you like to comment?
Yes, so I tend to agree with John both in framing and diagnosis. The thing that I would add to that is that the same generation have also benefited from the house price boom, which is unlikely to be seen again. And so we've done quite a bit of work on where taxation could focus on assets. Absolutely understand the point that it needs to raise revenue at the same time, but taxes also perform an important market-shaping role. And the other thing just to draw attention to is just that inheritances are set to more than double over the next 2 decades. So the wealth of that generation will pass down. The question is, who is it going to pass to? So what is an intergenerational question is also simultaneously an intra-generational question of inequality becoming worse for later generations.
Okay.
I would concur with the idea that there is an unfairness, and it does impact younger generations worse than older generations. If you only look at the public finances and you see that in the past 40 years, 5 years have been a surplus, what happens to that? Who has to pay that money back? Eventually, it will be younger generations now when they're older. and beyond that, so any deficit spending is essentially can only be neutral in intergenerational terms, because it is paid for by future generations of taxpayers and financed by borrowing, which comes from what could otherwise be spent on corporate investments, and therefore lowering growth and lowering economic improvement. And that again is something that's borne by future generations, i.e. younger people now. If looking at specifically at the at taxes, stamp duty, you might think is borne. The incidence is borne by older people because they tend to be property owners more. However, it exacerbates the housing crisis, and the impact of the housing crisis is more borne by younger people than older people. If you look at duties, tobacco, alcohol, air passenger duty, they are borne more by younger people, because younger people tend to be poorer, and in the case of alcohol and tobacco, they tend to be larger consumers, at least in volume terms rather than price terms in alcohol. But certainly the percentage of smokers, of people in age cohorts who are smokers, are 8% of over 65s and 19% of 18 to 34-year-olds. So all these duties tend to impact more on younger people than older people. So in total, there's definitely, in my opinion, a greater impact of the tax system on the young rather than the old. Okay,
well, thank you for those varied contributions. So I say, with four of you, we will have to keep the pace going. So perhaps I could go straight on to Baroness Thornhill.
Hi. We want to sort of nail you on a specific. Obviously, we've given us some big picture stuff. And John, you mentioned it. That is national insurance contributions. We have heard opposing views from Frank Field, who says, you know, I work, so why shouldn't I pay contributions? To a Treasury representative who said that it acts as a behavioural incentive to keep people in work longer. Do you think it's equitable that employee national insurance contributions cease at the state pension age, and if so, why?
I think it's no longer equitable. I think there was a logic to the system when most pensioners were poor, and when the aim of the system was a symbol. Of course, we know it's only a symbol, it's in some ways an accounting fiction, that what we do, and this is where I agree very much with what Warwick said, that we pay in our working lives and we tend to receive benefits after retirement. And the idea that we pay in contributions through our working life and then later we receive the state pension is a good way of describing what is going on. But we face problems, and I know that the committee knows very well the major problems that we face in terms of the escalating future costs of healthcare and in particular social care. And in a world where not all pensioners are poor, and where median pensioner incomes are similar to those of younger people, to exempt a substantial chunk of income of older people, much of it derived from defined benefit pensions, which were highly tax privileged as they were accumulated, seems to me that this is a moment where one could couple a tax on people who do have ability to pay with a need that they are painfully aware of paying for social care in a way that that might reduce the gamble in terms of whether it is their family who will be losing a large part of their inheritance. I know you're very well aware of all of that. I'm not suggesting full rate national insurance contributions, but something closer to the German model, as I understand it, of a low-level national insurance contribution on the people who are aware of that need, who can afford it above a threshold.
As I understand your questions about whether NICs should be applied to someone who carries on working after the retirement age, I think that John has gone into a much broader issue about applying NICs to savings income, pension income and investment income, which is rather out with, I think, what your question was. In terms of the narrow question, it all depends on the extent to which you think there should be a maintenance of the contributory principle. we've changed the contributory principle from 40 years down to 30, now to 35. There are people at the moment who are inquiring how the new arrangements are going to work and are getting somewhat disappointing and confused answers from the department involved about the number of years contributions they've got. So the idea that there isn't a contribution principle in play that's somewhat irritating people when we read the columns of the Sunday Times, Sunday Telegraph, the Financial Times on Saturday and listen to Money Box Live. So there is a contribution principle. And if while you want to maintain that, it doesn't make sense to actually apply it after someone isn't actually accumulating any more once they're out with the pension age rules. Of course, someone like myself, who, as I understand it, although I wouldn't actually put money on the table, appears to have a full house, I'm still actually contributing but not getting any more. So it's become a little bit muddied. But I probably would share the witness from the Treasury's view that one of the things you want to do is actually keep people working and stimulating because you want that output from them. That's the real prize to be had. Last night, Alan Greenspan came by video and spoke at a policy exchange event, and he made the point very strongly that one of the difficulties of payroll social security taxes in the United States is the way it's suppressed the savings ratio and capital formation and actually taken people out of the labour market. And I think that's one of the things we probably need to be a little bit wary of.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that question? Yes.
Yeah, so our view is that taxes are likely to need to rise due to demographic changes and parties pledging to end austerity, and that there is a place to ask older generations who have benefited from stronger wage growth throughout their working lives to pay more, particularly when some people are working later. On NICs specifically, it's become less strongly linked to insurance principles. And the notion that it is a contributory tax allows a regressive tax to take place. So we believe in kind of wholesale reform of NICs and making it more progressive for working age people as well as above state pension age, but that there is a role for people above state pension age to pay perhaps a reduced rate or indeed the full rate on employment income. And that could raise just above £1 billion in 2020 to 21. There is possibly a place for putting in place transition mechanisms so that you're not kind of going back on an understanding that people had throughout their working lives, particularly towards the end of their working lives.
I would say that given that the tax burden is such a historic high at the moment and the damage it's wreaking to productivity growth and the economy in general, I think the tax burden needs to fall. And so, I mean, when you look at NICs, as others have said, it is essentially another income tax now, but only on certain types of income, i.e. earned income. Is there a justification for having eligibility as age-based? No, not really. However, it's also unfair to impose new taxes on groups who have made plans based on those taxes. So how you go about addressing the various conflicting unfairnesses is a difficult question. But yeah, I would say that if you're starting a new tax system from scratch, you certainly wouldn't want a system like this.
Okay, for the record, was that Alan Greenspan you said?
Yes.
Okay. Baroness Blackstone, you wanted to come in?
Challenge what has just been said. This isn't a new tax. This would just be the continuation of an existing tax. And it is, you're perfectly right to say, it operates like a tax rather than a contribution, to go back to what you were saying. But the question I really want to ask is whether the Treasury argument that was put to us, that it's an important incentive to keep people in work, is actually credible, given all the other factors that will influence people's decision as to whether to continue in employment beyond the state pension age. There are many of them. Would this really make a much difference if we decided, or the government decided, that people would go on paying national insurance contributions whilst they continued in employment after the state pension age? Or would they suddenly all say, well, we're not going to go to work any longer? I'm puzzled by it, is what I'm saying. And I wonder whether Professor Hills or Mr. Lightfoot can respond
at some point. I mean, I think one of the reasons why the Treasury will be concerned about this is that when people have looked at things that interfere with work incentives, marginal income tax rates, payroll social security taxes are one that are generally being perceived within the OECD as something that actually is a disincentive to participate in the labour market. So I think it's generally accepted as guidance that you probably want to avoid heavy payroll security taxes if you can actually do it. So of all the things you can do in terms of taxation that diminishes labour market participation, it tends to be a payroll social security tax that actually gives the worst outcome for the amount of revenue you actually raise. And I would imagine that probably lies behind the concern expressed by the Treasury.
I think I might disagree with that, having agreed with at least half of what Warwick said in the previous answer. But I think it's an empirical question. I think it would be very good to have evidence on it. We know that the people who keep working after state pension age tend to be higher paid. They tend to have rewarding jobs. People like academics who rather enjoy what they're doing. And I suspect that that the marginal effect would be very, very relatively small. And I think we also need to pay attention to not just the substitution effect that was being described, but also the income effect. If people have got a target for what their income in retirement will be, then some of us might keep working a little bit longer to get there. Some people might have to work a little bit longer. But I suspect, compared with the other reasons why people keep on working, this is a rather small effect. But I would welcome somebody who's actually done serious analysis of it.
Okay, I'm mindful of time because there's a lot of ground to go through, but Baroness Crawley's promised me a very brief intervention.
Yes, very quickly. Caris Roberts, you said that if a lower NICS or a full NICS was imposed, the production would be from that would be £1 billion. Is that a lower or a full?
That's the full.
That's the full.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've got other ground to cover in terms of this business of taxation. I know that Baroness Tyler wanted to move us on.
Thank you. Several of you in your opening remarks talked about sort of shining a light, if you like, on the wealthier part of the younger retired generations. And indeed, I was struck by your comment, Warwick, about, I think, that those with the broadest back should make the greatest contribution. So in the light of that, my question is specifically about some of the universal pensioner benefits that we have at the moment, things like winter fuel payments, TV licences, bus travel, that sort of thing, and whether you feel that they should continue in the future to be universal, including some of the very wealthy pensioners, or whether some of the concerns that this committee's heard about unfairness in relation to those benefits would actually be better addressed through changes to the benefit themselves, who they're entitled to, and indeed who's entitled to them. Frank Field, when giving us evidence, said he suggested that some of these pensioner benefits should be treated as taxable income. So there's obviously different ways of treating it, but I'd be grateful for your views.
Okay. Can I try and be as quick as possible?
Yeah.
I think there's one very important principle which the Pensions Commission, which I was a member of, took a lot of time on, which was trying to reduce the extent of means testing in old age. And I think that's where a lot of the disincentive issues about the combination of taxes and benefits can cause in terms of people's future accumulation. So looking at the smaller benefits you mentioned, the one I'd want to concentrate on is winter fuel payments. I did some work on this for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, as was on fuel poverty. It's quite clear that winter fuel payments are almost the least effective way of coping with fuel poverty. I would much rather that money was diverted to something that made a difference to the people at risk of fuel poverty in terms of permanent solution and the installation of their homes.
Thank you.
I think the most important thing is we've got to actually have a basic state pension that is universal, that enables a base for someone to actually base their long-term savings and long-term retirement income on. Because I think we do underestimate, unless you're fortunate enough to work in the same job, particularly in a public sector framework where you can move from employer to employer and still actually have the pension, it's very hard for people, even when they've been really quite well paid, to accumulate a reliable stock of financial assets that can yield a reliable income when you're of retirement age. So I think that base is very, very important. We should also acknowledge we actually have one of the stingiest replacement ratios from that basic state pension of any advanced economy. And it became somewhat stingier in relative terms because of the decision made in 1981 to actually only uprate it by prices rather than wages. So we've got a very stingy replacement ratio, and I don't think we should actually erode that or means test it. I think the OECD and the IMF have been playing with this idea. I don't think it's a good idea to go down that route. In terms of some of the other benefits, I think it's perfectly legitimate to look at them. And as John rightly says, some of them were built up precisely because the old age pension was so stingy, it wasn't being uprated, and therefore we were forced to go down the credits route and these other ones. I think some of them are really very awkwardly aligned, and particularly in London. Now, I'm 61. I'm thrilled with this. I got this a bus pass, tube pass and rail pass. It even reduces the cost of my travel to where I live in Plymouth at the weekend by about five or 7 quid. And I tell you, week in, week out, that's very helpful. I'm very pleased to have it. Now, I don't know these days how much this costs, but it's a very substantial bill. The number I gave him was wrong, but I bet you it's going to be something like 60, 70 million pounds across London. I'd be very surprised much less than that. The kind of help we give people who have serious difficulty of accessing transport, dial-a-ride, the sorts of things that Sally and Nick and I have spent half a lifetime being involved in. You are very careful on the eligibility criteria, the number of rides you can have and all the rest of it. We've got that completely out of balance. And I'm sure that, along with the television licence and the winter fuel payments, are things one could actually consider, and I'd have an open mind about that. The only thing I would say is, don't be too clever about means testing and taxation, because the administrative messing about actually becomes a nuisance factor in itself. But I think you want to make sure your basic state pension isn't means tested, and I fully support the decisions taken in 2010, because I don't think you could have sustained that kind of very stingy replacement ratio that we actually had before. But I've got an open mind on what to do about the others. I'm not clever enough to give you any guidance at the moment of what should happen to them.
No fans yet. What about, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, so winter fuel payments, I don't have the evidence in front of me on the effectiveness versus other interventions. One thing we did do is look at what would happen if you limit it to those receiving pension credit, which is one of the mooted ways to means test it, which sounds sensible, but what we found is that because pension credit take-up is quite low, it actually ends up being quite regressive, and also because of the structure of families. So there's just a need to be quite careful about how you means test it if you do go for that option, and potentially with the administrative trade-offs it might not be worth it. You might want to go for kind of all or nothing.
Okay. Do you want to comment, Mr. Meakin?
I would disagree with that. I would say that it should be means tested, most of those benefits I can think of, and frankly they're all dreamed up as headline grabbers on budget days, and they have insulting names that older people are supposed to do this or that with the particular money that the government is giving them. And I would think it's more dignifying to just give people money if they have low incomes, rather than give little labels as to how they're supposed to spend it.
Okay. I'm sure Mr. Hall of the BBC will be pleased to hear some of these comments. Can we move on to... oh, sorry, Baroness Greengross, did you want to? Yes, I do apologise.
As Warwick said, I've spent a lot of years looking at these issues. But I do feel that if somebody is continuing to work well after the state pension age, which is a long time before it moves, it's a very slow process, that if they're continuing to work amongst people who are, there are people who are getting a very high salary because they are the bosses of the business. And when their research assistant doesn't even get the travel pass, which you love so much, as do I, it does seem to me to be really unfair, and that it would be better if all those benefits were declared, and therefore people with very high incomes would be taxed on them. So you go on giving them out to everyone, because everyone loves the travel pass, etc., etc. But you tax people so that those who are high earners should pay insurance and so on, but be but be taxed like everyone else, because in a way, if you are continuing to work and you're the boss of a company or something, why should you not be taxed on those benefits? I just don't understand
I'm
it.
concerned about that, Chairman, because one of the things you don't want to do is fiscal churning. I shouldn't have this full stop. I shouldn't be given it, and then someone comes and takes... That kind of churn is the last thing we want. I also am very concerned. We're trying to get as many older people out of having to do tax returns unless they really need to do them. And that's a large part of the Chancellor's changes to the older person's tax regime. And it's very important you don't actually invite older people to fill in complex tax forms that they may not need to do. So I'm a bit wary for those sorts of practical reasons. I think probably you need to actually find some way of slowly over time removing them, because when you're 61 you shouldn't be getting what's in my pocket right now. As much as I love it, and I'm very grateful, and thank you very much.
I think there is one system that might help, which is technically known as grandfathering, but presumably should be something more neutral these days, grandparenting, and to allow the age at which you receive it to rise rather than immediately taking it away. But I think I come back to the same point, that the money could be more effectively used to tackle the underlying problem of fuel poverty. So there's a question of how we phase it out without upsetting people's immediate budgets. I think the ages are wrong at the moment. One way of avoiding complicated means testing is to move those ages up so that you're biting at the group that are most affected. But in the long run, my aim would be to be using those resources more effectively.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all been quite very clear. Mr. Lightfoot, you're going to be a hero to the 61-year-olds of the country who are watching this, I'm sure. I'm going to bring in Lord Bishard to take us on to property taxation.
I'm astonished that no one's mentioned the Christmas bonus, which some of us are really looking forward to receiving. Is going to change our financial situation dramatically, and heaven knows what the cost of... Anyway. I want to talk about property, because in the recent past the government has tended to tax property transactions through the likes of stamp duty rather than the consumption of property through the likes of council tax. Do you think this is the right decision for government to have made? Do you think we need to revisit property taxes in this country? And if so, what would your suggestions be?
Again, I'll try and be as quick as possible, but I think the brief answer is that the balance is not right. That if you look at one of the committee's main concerns, which is housing for younger people, the last thing we need is for property transactions to be gummed up by people who feel that it's expensive to move and it's better to leave property empty, or to not move and use it and downsize and use it more effectively. Stamp duty is very unhelpful in that regard, whereas making council tax in some way more closely related to capital values of property and the size of properties, with all of the provisions you need to cope with the asset-rich, income-poor problem by way of delayed payments, would be a much more effective way to do it. I know, the underlying economics is always that transaction taxes are a bad idea, whereas taxes which capture current flows of benefits, which come in kind in the case of valuable housing, are a better way of running our tax system.
I actually don't share that view. I think that it's very difficult to tax wealth and property. I mean, John's quite right. The people don't always have the cash income to foot the tax bill on the property. And the difficulty is that if we had a proper income tax system, the way that it was theoretically considered in the first part of the 20th century, we would tax a change in someone's economic power from one point in time to another. We don't do it because they haven't actually got the wherewithal to pay the tax. So what you do is you tax flows of income. You try to tax flows of spending, you tax events. Now, I think John's absolutely right. You don't want to have very heavy transaction taxes, because you want people to be able to arrange their fares as it suits them. You don't want to get in their way of doing it. But you've got to be realistic about what you can extract from property taxes. There's a role for a property tax. We've got it. We already in this country levy charges on property I think roughly above the OECD average, and I think it might even be substantially above the OECD average. So insofar as there's a trick that you can take on taxing property in its various forms, we certainly do it. And I think it's worth bearing in mind how we moved to where we are now with the council tax. Two things happened. People loathed domestic rates. There were terrible rows over domestic rates, and they went on and on and on. They were removed by the community charge. To illustrate how contentious that property tax was, the New Statesman produced a very powerful leading article where it said all the things wrong with the poll tax and the community charge. At the bottom it said, we published this 20 years ago when the rating system was revalued and we transposed community charge in place of rates. So property taxes are extremely contentious. And one of the things I think it's very important is ensuring we get public support for the public services we want and the taxes we need to fund them. You've got to pluck the goose in a gentle way, as Colbert put it. You do not want to cause the goose to hiss. And it's very important that you actually have taxes that actually don't irritate the public. The transaction taxes and property taxes do that. And this is one of the reasons why in much of the United States they find it very difficult to get consent for the kind of public services and taxes they need, because they make a disproportionate use, albeit not quite as high as us, I think, of property taxes, and they don't have a proper expenditure tax. And so I would be careful about irritating the public. When the council tax began to rise between 1996 and about 2004, 2005, there was a hissy fit from the public. You remember all those people getting very, very cross indeed. And I think you want to be very wary indeed. These complex public services delivered by local government and national government have essentially got to be funded by taxes on income and taxes on expenditure.
Can I press you a little bit on that? Because you're telling us that transaction taxes are not a great idea, and that we should be really careful about property taxes. But you're not.
So I didn't hear the last bit.
You're saying we should be really difficult about property taxes because it's an irritable thing. You're not actually pointing us towards what your preferred solution would be.
Oh yes, I'm very clear that I think that you have to actually look for buoyant sources of recurrent revenue, and that means taxing flows of income and flows of expenditure. And I would say because of the deadweight and distortion costs that arise out of taxation of expenditure and complex issues like the double taxation of savings income and labour supply, I would actually probably have the emphasis on taxation of expenditure as opposed to income. And just going back to your earlier discussion, it's worth bearing in mind, in relation to older households, of course, the balance of taxation shifted from income towards expenditure through VAT, which has more than doubled in the last 30 years, 40 years.
So you would be in favour of putting up VAT?
I would make greater use of expenditure taxes in general, and also I think you've got to actually have a substantial income tax.
Okay. We probably haven't got time to go further. Sorry.
I don't think I've met an economist who thinks that stamp duty is a good tax. It distorts decisions over moving house, as John identified, and penalises frequent movers, which ultimately holds up land prices. Having said that, we clearly do need some system of property taxation, and we need a system that can capture some of the huge gains that homeowners have seen, which is keeping wealth inequality high, particularly on an intergenerational axis. So we do propose a property tax. The reason for that is that if you have capital, if you remove the exemption on capital gains on first homes, then you're kind of left with the transaction tax again, and there are huge difficulties with that. A property tax would be a part consumption tax, so it would actually be taxing the consumption of housing alongside taxing the locational value, and it would have the potential to be much more progressive than the current system, so that's why we argue for it. I think on irritating the public, it's important to note that actually housing is the major issue for younger people and for the millennial generation and below. And actually you will start irritating that generation if we don't crack this issue. And as such, I think property taxation has to be key to solving this problem.
I would fully agree with what John says. Stamp duty is probably, in my opinion, it certainly was before the changes from the slab system, and I think it might still be the worst tax on the books. And I would like to add that, I mean, often we think of the reason why stamp duty is such a terrible tax is because it keeps older people, empty nesters, if you like, in larger homes and prevents them when they would otherwise prefer to move, when it makes sense in their opinion to move to somewhere smaller, from doing so. I think as well as that, it prevents people from moving away from locations which are convenient for labour markets to locations which aren't so great for that when it no longer suits their needs. And perhaps, typically it might be moving from London to the coast or something like that. It's those kind of misallocation problems it brings up, as well as just the size of the properties. I would say that the property taxes as a share of GDP are not among the highest. They are the highest according to OECD data. And the problem with property values having risen so high is that the prices are always and everywhere a measure of scarcity. And the problem is not that older people have too much of that, the value of that artificial scarcity. It's the problem is that we have the artificial scarcity. So the solution is not to tax the upside for the winners of that scarcity. Instead, it's to reduce the scarcity in the first place, i.e., build more houses.
Okay. Yes, briefly, yes.
Rory has been kind enough to agree with me, but I do disagree with the last point he made, in that in this country we had, the last time I looked at it in 2014 numbers, in England, we have more residential floor space per person than we have ever had, and yet we have a housing crisis. One of our problems is that we are not making the optimal use of the space we've got. And we have a property tax, regardless of whether the overall level is right. There is an equity issue in the relativity between what people in less valuable property and more valuable property pay. I looked last year at a flat in Kensington for sale for £300,000 and a house for sale a mile away in Kensington for £30 million. The council tax in Kensington Chelsea payable by the £30 million house was £24 a week higher than the £300,000 flat.
Okay.
Yes, that's sort of true, but the reason the £30 million property is £30 million is not because council tax is a little bit too low. It's because there aren't enough of them.
I think you have a housing supply issue, and you're not going to resolve it by a housing taxation solution. And of course, the value of them has been substantially aggravated by very loose monetary conditions in relation to housing. The Bank of England has presided over a very loose monetary policy going right back to about 20 years, where they discounted house prices as part of the inflation target they actually had. And, of course, one of the things we shouldn't overlook in terms of intergenerational fairness is that the quantitative easing has actually pushed down the interest rates, which is very good for younger householders, and been very bad for older savers and people actually wanting an income from savings, because rates of return on assets have gone down, not least bonds.
Okay. I'm going to have to move on, but I know Lord Hollick wants to pursue intergenerational transfers.
Yes, so can we look at the way we currently tax the transfer of money between generations? And Carrie's, Robert's asking you a question, acknowledging my fact that I'm a trustee of the IPPR. In your recent report on the Commission on Economic Justice, you made a strong case for the introduction of capital transfer tax. Now, I think, if I recall correctly, we did have capital transfer taxes back in the mid-70s to the mid-80s. So in giving us your rationale for that, can you just explain why it was introduced and why it was dropped after 10 years?
So I'm not sure I can answer that part, but I can certainly answer why we think that it is the right solution. So inheritance tax, as it's currently formed, is easily avoided if you are wealthy, healthy and well advised, is the phrase that's normally described. And that's because you don't have to pay it if you transfer capital more than 7 years before your death, which it penalises people who might become ill unexpectedly, It penalises people who don't have financial advice and means that we don't raise that much from the system. We propose the gift tax or the capital transfer tax as a way to make sure that that can't be avoided on those arbitrary means anymore. And it would be levied on the recipient rather than the giver. And that's partly because we think that could be more acceptable to people. It's not obvious, that's an empirical issue, but that's something that we're interested in. And it also incentivises the breaking up of parts of wealth to younger generations. They do have this in Ireland, and I'm going to anticipate Warwick's response in that. So Ireland does have this, and it hasn't raised a huge amount of revenue in recent years. That's because of the dramatic fall in asset prices going on in Ireland at the moment. But potentially it could raise as much as 9 billion additional on top of what inheritance tax currently raises. That's modelling from the Resolution Foundation. So it would be a fairer way to raise revenue that would make it harder, not impossible, but make it harder to avoid that tax. And if then spent on things that equalised opportunity and wealth, it could have greater legitimacy.
And the 9 billion would be, if you introduced it, at what level?
So that's a personal allowance of 125,000.
And then above that?
Above that, that would be equal to income tax rates.
Equal to the income tax.
So it would go into your income tax schedule.
And that would compare with the IHT that it's replacing, which raises how much?
Off the top of my head, I think it would raise 15 billion in total. So,
about 5 billion. Roughly 5 billion.
Going from 5 billion up to 15 billion.
Okay, thank you. I may be able to help you with the answer that why it was got rid of. As you remember, capital transfer tax was introduced by Dennis Healey in the 1975 finance bill. And of course, it was in that finance bill that Mrs. Thatcher offered that devastating critique both of the Chancellor and the proposition that made her bid to become Conservative leader so much more effective. It was a very unpopular tax. And I think the difficulty with actually having a transfer tax, particularly one that goes to individuals, the amount of record keeping that people are going to have to do over their lifetime, clocking assets they have and how they transfer them and how they receive them. You may have seen the Tax Simplification Commission has put out a paper on the complexity of inheritance tax as it currently is, where many people who have no liability to this tax are caught up in doing it before they can get probate. Many people who have no liability to inheritance tax will find themselves caught up in an administrative regime that will achieve very little. I might add that for many households, the thought of actually not having a threshold of £325,000, but something more like £120,000 will be about as popular as finding a dead mouse in your kitchen cabinet. And it goes back to the Colbert issue. Inheritance taxes are phenomenally unpopular, even amongst those people who will never have a liability to them. And one of the things that's fascinating as an economist is the way people approach assets and their own lives. So they have a very powerful bequest motive, which vitiates the permanent income hypothesis, because otherwise we'd all die leaving nothing. And there was a fascinating suite of work done by, or published by the American Economic Journal about 15 years ago, called The Economics of Thanatomology. I think it's a posh Greek word for being dead. And what it shows is that people try and accumulate a huge amount of assets to pass on to other generations. Also, of course, I think there's some people who I don't have children, but I certainly don't want to run out of cash at the end. And I think we underestimate that bequest motive in people's work effort and all sorts of things. I might add that some very egalitarian countries like Canada and Sweden, of course, have abolished inheritance tax.
Okay, who else? I'll let Gareth Roberts reply to that before we pass on, but I want to hear from John Hills and Rory Meakin first. Since you both indicated, did you not want to come?
Well, first, I'm sorry. Yes, I don't want to come in too much on this, but I think there is an issue in terms of inheritance tax of accidental bequests that I think many people under the current social care regime will be over-accumulating resources if they can to cope with the risk that they might have to pay for very large amounts of social care. That will only be 1 in 10 who end up paying, the numbers have gone up a bit since Still Not did it, are paying over £100,000. But there will be a lot of money sitting there as it were, by accident, which will go to heirs. If we had a more effective social care system in terms of paying for social care, there would be less of that around. At the moment, I think there is that money which could be captured through transfer taxes of one kind or another.
Well, Mr. Meakin, then I'm going to let...
I think one of the things you want from a good tax system is neutrality and the lack of distortions. And whether or not you have taxes on bequests, I think hinges on how you treat bequests. Whether you can view them firstly as income that is received, tax when it's received, and then spent by the person who receives it, or the person transfers it on to their heir, and then they spend it, and therefore it's taxed at income, and then it's taxed when it's spent. And there's no, if you introduce a tax in the middle, that's a distortion. Or you can, which is how most families actually view these things, and which is why I think it's phenomenally, in fact, if I remember rightly, it's the most unpopular of all taxes, despite only affecting 7%, I think, of estates. Or you can view it, you can view this right at the individual. So if you inherit money, that's no different to earning money, and if you view it from that perspective, then you would think, why should the taxes be any different on the two of them? And that creates a distortion. So I think whichever of those two options you take, they lead you to either taxing both inheritance and capital transfers, or neither. And the problem, I lean towards neither because of the administrative problems which Warwick discussed. So, but I think fundamentally you really do need to do both or neither. And the current system of enormous exemptions for certain types of assets is crazy.
Okay, now brief reply from Keris Robertson. I know Viscount Chandos wants to come in. I'm looking at the clock. Yes, come on.
Yeah. So it does, of course, hinge on whether you see multi-generational families as one economic unit. I would argue that given the increasing importance of inheritance, we do need to start splitting those out. On the administration point, we spoke to a number of tax experts for our report, and many of them actually raised that with new technologies and digital technologies, there's no excuse for complicated tax returns and not being able to track those things. So in time, we should be able to make that process simpler.
Nice quick questions for Mr. Lightfoot. Surely bequests and inter vivas capital transfers falls very perfectly under your definition of flows where you can naturally take tax. So I can't quite see how you can make the thesis that that's where you need to look for tax revenue, but resist a more comprehensive and fairer system of taxation of both capital transfers and bequests.
I accept entirely that death is an event, and therefore when an event happens, you can actually levy a tax as a matter of practicality. What I'm saying is it's not going to be a reliable source of recurrent flows of revenue, and I think you will find that in most countries, inheritance tax, even when you try and make it much more effective, that means getting more money, is always very disappointing in its revenue yields. And I might just say to John, the interesting thing about the potential overaccumulation of capital and inheritance, it's quite interesting. I share John's views, I think probably on social care, I would imagine. The work done in the United States actually is in a country which probably treats long-term care through Medicaid more like the way that John and I would probably approach it. So in that sense, that American analogy I drew would still survive a more generous long-term care arrangement. But I do not think you're going to find out of either capital gains tax or inheritance tax, you're going to have the recurrent flows of income that you can rely on. So, because capital values are very unreliable, and all countries that have tried to actually raise substantial sums of money from it are often disappointed.
Okay, sustainability. Baroness Greengross, did you want to cover your point? Okay, well, Baroness Crawley, unless there's anybody else wants to come in. Final question.
So this is the could make one change question to the tax and benefit system in order to improve intergenerational fairness, what would it be?
Could I say, I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with the question, because I think doing one change is a mistake. I don't think you should be talking about taxes without talking about spending, or spending without talking about taxes. And I think for this particular committee, it's very important to be talking both about social care and the problems for the old, and housing for the young. So I would couple doing something about payments of national insurance or something equivalent in old age with funding social care. I would couple a more progressive council tax system with doing something about the provision of affordable housing for young people. But I wouldn't uncouple and just do one thing.
Okay, fair point.
John is absolutely right. The two changes I would have in my mind that have a specifically tax dimension to them are, I think, withdrawing the personal allowances between about £122,000 is extremely damaging for work incentives. I'd want to do that. And secondly, the withdrawal of the child benefit between £50,000 and £60,000 is likewise very damaging. And it's worth remembering that that is originally a tax relief that was turned into a social security transfer payment to make it more efficient, and I think we should return it to where it was before. We'll always have arguments about how generous it should be, how it should be indexed or whatever, but I think actually withdrawing it from households with children between £50,000 and £60,000 is an extremely distorting thing of the tax system. And the other thing I would actually do is picking up John's baton about long-term care, and obviously we could I would draw a halt there, but of course I would actually fundamentally change the planning system so we get more land in use for housing and commercial activities, and also for the public service as well. The restrictions on land use are far too limited, so those would be my principal areas of activity.
What would you do about social care?
Social care, I think that we've got to accept that if I could have that gangling cyst done for free, but if I have a stroke in front of you and I need very intense personal social care, I'll be on my own until I'm in the hands of the social security system. And I think we've got to actually fund long-term social care of a complex character in the way we fund the National Health Service, because you cannot make a service free at the point of use concur with one where there's a draconian means testing regime. And, of course, you can't just say, I'd like a bit of social care, please. You go through a very stringent assessment, and there'll always be debates about how generous we make it or whatever. But I think this is something that the Sutherland Royal Commission, and a bit more of it, has got to be bit, in my view.
Well, we're getting into a very elastic definition of one. Though I do...
John started it.
No, we accept those comments, and of course we accept the complexities and the interrelationships. I say, of course, social care we are fully aware is a fundamental issue, but it is being addressed by another committee of the House at the moment, which is why we haven't been directly focusing on it, but I assure you it will. It's much in our thoughts. Sorry, you were allowed a one with a bit of elasticity?
Yeah. So I do agree it needs to be seen holistically, but if I had one priority, it would be fixing the taxation of residential property. House prices have risen 4 times faster than wages since 1997. We're investing in infrastructure projects in London that are estimated to raise land values by £87 billion, with only less than half of that captured back in taxation. And our current council tax system is regressive and penalises the young who tend to live in properties that have high council tax relative to their value. So the whole system just isn't working. To fix that, I would propose a property tax that I described earlier to replace council tax, and getting rid of exemptions that incentivise investment in housing as assets over other asset types. So, for instance, the exemption on property and inheritance tax.
The single most... firstly, I would agree with everything John said. The single most important aspect of intergenerational unfairness is the housing crisis. To fix that, you need to you need planning reform of the type the Taxpayers Alliance has advocated, and in more detail, London YIMBY has proposed. If it has to be a tax and benefit measure, though, I would probably freeze the state pension.
Okay, well that's a dramatic end to the dramatic end to a session which we can't do. If you would like to submit us some evidence on that point, we'll be very interested. Now, in conclusion, can I? In conclusion, can I thank you all for coming, and also say to Professor Hills, we're grateful for your informal advice on another occasion. We're obviously mindful of that also, as put on the record. So I'm very grateful to the four of you. Thank you. And we've managed to keep to time, which with four is not always easy. And